This session this afternoon is going to be looking at water security, and we've got 3 outstanding speakers for you. The lady on my left, who's looking not so convinced about that, is Rachel Cassidy, who's a catchment hydrologist with the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Northern Ireland. On my left is Eike Ludling, who is a senior decision support analyst at the World Agroforestry Centre, formerly based in Nairobi. And on the far right, on my far right, is David MacDonald, who's a hydrogeologist from the British Geological Society. Survey. Whoops. Oh, right, yes, carry on. Should have just said BGS.
Yeah, I am a Geological Society.
So we're looking at water security, which moves on from this morning's sessions on a rural focus and an urban focus. There's various definitions of water security, which I don't think we should necessarily get into, but one of the more succinct ones is a socially acceptable level of water-related risk. And it tries to encompass water resources and water services. And I'm sure our speakers will wonderfully expound upon that as we go through in the afternoon. And I would like to invite Rachel if she would like to start us off.
Okay, well, our project focused on coastal East Africa. And I'm just going to give you a very brief synopsis of what we've done on the project. What do I do with this? Okay. So our interest in the coastal zone is based on that coastal zones of East Africa are going to be subject to the most rapid population growth in Africa in coming decades. With increased population come increased urbanisation and water demand. And the other unique problem in coastal areas is the presence of salt water. And you can see in the diagram on the right that it's hydrogeology with a bit extra when you have to deal with 2 different density of fluids. So as demand increases, abstraction increases, more wells are drilled, saline water is drawn into existing water supply, and saline wells is a massive problem right along the coast. As well, with urban growth, there's contamination of water supply through poor source protection, and these were all aspects that we looked at as part of the project. Tied in again with that is environmental change, not only changes in rainfall patterns which are affecting recharge and land use change through land clearance for agriculture affecting recharge, but also you've sea level change in all areas will affect that saline interface and affect more and more wells as time progresses. At the bottom is a sort of image reflecting the area that we work in. Most of these coastal regions are low-lying coastal soft sedimentary platforms, not much elevation, so a lot of potential for saline intrusion. Our objectives in the UPGro Catalyst project were to develop coastal groundwater monitoring networks in 3 sites in Tanzania, Kenya and the Comoros Islands. We wanted to establish the status of the groundwater resource in these type areas, to identify issues with past practices and propose alternatives. I can't go into all our methodology, but we broke it into characterising the resource using well surveys, geophysical surveys across each site. We did secondary data collection, high resolution monitoring of weather, land use change mapping, and then at the core of it all was our engagement with the local community. From the start of the project, we met with community leaders and stakeholders in those areas and maintained contact throughout the project. And so this identical methodology was applied to each area that we worked in. At the bottom right is a sort of map of our study area in the Indian Ocean. Kilifi, just north of Mombasa, was the Kenyan site. Kilwa in southeast Tanzania was our Tanzanian site, and in the Comoros Islands we focused on the island of Grand Comore. We chose different typologies, different urban, rural proportions of population, geologically different volcanic islands compared to soft sedimentary coastal settings. In Kilifi, the main pressures are rapid urbanisation linked to Mombasa but also to tourism, and both domestic and international tourism, and the establishment of a university there in the early 2000s, which has brought in 15,000 extra people to the area. Boreholes are widely abandoned due to salinity, collapse and drying out. As part of our surveys, the drying out is associated to over-abstraction, but also due to fallen rainfall in that area in recent years. Less than 50% of demand can be met by groundwater. Kilwa in Tanzania is a World Heritage Site of huge archaeological importance and has a growing tourist industry. It's relatively rural and is poorly connected because of roads to Dar es Salaam being under repair permanently. It's a rural setting. To the north on the peninsula is Kilwa Masoko, which is an urban setting that's growing annually and has now become a service port for the oil and gas fields to the northeast. Kilwa Kisiwani is a coral island with a very small population of 500 or 600 people, completely reliant on groundwater and collected surface water, and has extreme problems with salinity and lack of provision. Kilwa Masoko has water resources. As you move west, you move into sedimentary rock with good storativity. So they're able to pipe water in, but the infrastructure is poor. So they were the Tanzanian site. In Grand Comore, we looked at the whole island. It's a recent volcanic rocks, very high porosity. The aquifers are deep. And the water infrastructure on the island is very, very poor in its present state and leading to an awful lot of aggravated tension in the communities there. 60% of wells on the island, you can see the orange and red dots around the edge where the communities live, have very high salinities above the World Health Organization recommended limit in 60% of sites. They've an observed decrease and change in pattern of rainfall as well. So sort of to try and synthesize, because we use the same methodology, we've been able to compare each of our 3 sites. In all areas, quality and quantity are massive issues. Wells and boreholes are the main source in all 3 areas. Salinity is the major issue, and there are, with increase in urbanisation, a direct increase in the presence of fecal coliforms in wells. What we have found is the main issue in these areas is that well installation techniques aren't optimised for a coastal setting. And wells collapse because of the soft sediment, fail shortly after and become saline very quickly. And the use of geophysical prospection is very rare. Just to demonstrate this, on the island of Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania, in the foreground you have a 12th century open wide diameter well. In the background you have a Finnish development agency modern deep narrow borehole with a hand pump. The first time I went to Kisiwani, the hand pump was working about 5 years ago, but it's since failed, but it was always saline within a few months of the well being installed. So for the island at the moment, the 12th century shallow wide well is the only reliable source of water. And the construction of the wells is crucial in that. Wider diameters increase the intake area, they reduce drawdown, and they don't, because they're shallow, they're not pulling up the salt water like a straw, compared on the left to the modern boreholes. Another issue is that if they collapse, a modern borehole's finished. If a wider diameter borehole collapses, the local community can get down the well and sort it out. So what we have found in both Tanzania and Kenya, less so in Tanzania and Comoros, less so in Kenya, has been a sort of short-termism in development projects that have been working in those areas. They have 3 years, they have X amount of money, they have to do something. They know that drilling a hand-dug well to 100 metres in Camorris would take 3 years maybe for one well. So there have been instances where even against the scientists' advice, the development agencies have gone ahead and drilled boreholes, which has failed shortly after and become saline almost instant, within a month. So that was something we thought we had to raise out of this. Another thing is that local knowledge. In the 12th century, people knew that well and its wide diameter, and it's maybe because it was all they could build, was functional, and local people still say that. So for us, it's important that local knowledge should be utilised by people coming to work in those areas. All the communities are noticing environmental change. Long-term data analysis as well has shown increased in Tanzania, particularly of high-intensity rainfall events, to change and recharge. Communities overwhelmingly want to be involved in the management of their own water resources. They were really passionate about it because it's essential to them. All our areas we work in have very high levels of poverty. Where there is money, it's a few compared to the many who don't have it, and those were mainly where we focused our surveys. Low levels of education, income and limited livelihood all limit communities. Also, greater education and awareness is really needed. When we explained through the community groups different aspects of source protection, the community took that on board immediately. All the communities were very critical of governance, but actually when we look at governance, things seem to be improving in those countries. Well, in terms, as well, they were very critical of scientists coming to work in their communities. It came out in the questionnaires that we go there and we do our surveys and we do our studies and we gather it all up, but we never feed back. And I suppose we did feed back so far. And one of the things which has changed has been in Kilwa, Masoko, where right in the centre of the well field, the community had established a dump. Through the meetings, we discussed this and explained the risk of contamination. And since that has happened, the community put pressure on the local water management agencies, and that dump's been moved. So I think that's just a very brief overview of what we've done and our key findings. Mainly that we really feel strongly that appropriate technologies need to be used in coastal areas, that training among the engineers and water managers in those areas, they haven't had any training specifically for groundwater in coastal areas. So there's education needed both at the stakeholder level and the community level. And education, I think we believe should start from the bottom up with schools in those areas, so that right through they feel ownership of their own resource. That's it. That's the amount of time.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was a very succinct and clear discussion of some really important topics. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Eike Ludeling from the World Agroforestry Centre. So if you'd like to take the floor.
Yeah, it's easier with the remote control. Right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to talk about a study we've done in Kenya, led by the World Agroforestry Centre, and we've assessed risks of developing groundwater of the Merti Aquifer in northern Kenya to supply water to the city of Wajir at the border of, in Wajir County, northern Kenya. So here's a map of the region. You can see that it looks fairly arid, and it actually is. So there's not a whole lot of vegetation here. It's a very water scarce area. You see, this is the border to Somalia, so it's not a lot of water. And it's, of course, a problem when you have large cities developing, and that's currently happening in Wajir town. So it's the administrative capital of the county up there. And the population is exploding, and it's estimated at the moment at something like 300,000 people, but it's very poorly known, actually. And projections are that it might even hit 1 million at some point in the future. But water resources are incredibly poor. Most of the water supply relies on shallow wells, and they are increasingly contaminated through all kinds of sources of pollutants, and so it's really not a sustainable solution at the moment. But the government has already cooked up a plan to alleviate the problem, and that is a pipeline in this case that is supposed to tap the Murty Aquifer. There you can see in the where that green spot there is, there's a bit of water. There's one of the biggest aquifers in Kenya is there, and it could be tapped, and water could be conducted to the city. So that's a project that's currently being discussed. Problem is that, of course, it's also water that's potentially taken away from others. That's always an issue. And there is another town where this water is coming from. It's called Haberswain, and people have voiced strong concerns about those abstraction plans. And there certainly are some issues about equity and sharing of the resource. So yeah, this wasn't our idea. It was actually this was a plan made by the government of Kenya a while ago. So they initiated the planning process, but then we've heard in the morning already that a lot of decision-making power got passed on to the counties in Kenya. So currently the planning process resides with the county government. So the initiative is there. One of the problems so far is that there's been very little stakeholder involvement. Yeah, so many people are very poorly informed, even though they might be very strongly affected by this intervention. So that has been deficient so far. The county is doing a bit of a better job of hearing stakeholders now. But so far there is a lot of opposition, in particular, as I said, in Haberswain, because in northern Kenya you don't easily take away water from somewhere to someone else, at least not without compensation. So there is already a development donor who's basically said, well, they might fund this project if feasibility studies are undertaken and things look feasible. Up to 38 million euros could be on the table. But so far only hydrological risks have been assessed. And there are a lot of other things that can go wrong in this enterprise. There are a lot of risks in this project that have not been considered, but adequate methods for actually including all of these risks into the consideration have been lacking so far. And that's where we come in, because at ECRAF, at the World Agroforestry Center, we are working on ways to help people make decisions in complex systems under uncertainty. Because development decisions normally affect many stakeholders. It's not normally easy to make these decisions, but as we heard several times this morning already, we don't normally have enough data to really make the perfect decisions with the tools that we're normally using. And often it's an illusion that we might ever have this data, so we might as well work on ways to help us make decisions in the absence of perfect information. And there are often many outcomes. So surprising maybe, but some development projects actually fail, so they don't always succeed, and we should have an idea of anticipating how likely certain things are to succeed before we even start planning them. Now, most traditional scientific approaches are ill-equipped for such situations. We're not particularly good dealing with kind of intangible factors and with imperfect information in many of the techniques we're using. And so we've looked towards business analysis methods that are much better suited, because an entrepreneur making a decision always faces similar situations. There is uncertainty, and still action has to be taken. And there are actually quite useful approaches for dealing with that situation. And the one that we have used to guide our analysis in this project is called applied information economics. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it is basically a Monte Carlo-based method of helping us deal with such a setting. The rough outline of this is that we start with participatory modeling. So we invite our stakeholders into the research process and develop a model together with these researchers. Basically, we co-produce this model to ensure also later on that they're on board and that they actually recognize and use our findings. This works, of course, best if we actually have the decision makers in the room, or at least their technical advisors. We then sometimes have to refine the model a bit and convert it into mathematical code. And then we can identify the major uncertainties, so basically all the variables that we don't have perfect information on. And then the next step is then that we take our stakeholders, the people who have helped us build the model, and we could also invite other people into the process, and calibrate them. Yeah? So we basically subject them to structured training to help them estimate confidence intervals or probability distributions. Because most people initially aren't very good at that, especially scientists, but it is actually a skill that can be learned. And then we ask them to actually provide us estimates of the uncertain variables. Yeah? Basically their confidence intervals say we're 90% sure that this variable is within a certain range, rather than shooting for the perfectly precise estimates, which almost certainly is wrong in most cases. So once we have this, we can run our model in a probabilistic mode. As I said, it's a Monte Carlo simulation, so we run it many times with different possible values, and then we get a distribution of outcomes. that will then already help us get an idea of the plausible impacts of the intervention, of the decision that we're taking here. It also allows us to actually identify those variables those uncertainties that are critical for making better decisions. So we can find out the priorities for measurements, which are really the variables that constrain our ability to say what's going to happen. We can take those measurements and then run the whole cycle again, and hopefully at some point we'll get to a point where we can really make a well-informed recommendation of what decisions should be taken. We did a few other analyses that I won't go into in detail now. We did stochastic hydrological modeling as well, and also extensive socioeconomic surveys that I don't think I have time to present here. So in our case, we started with a one-day inception and discussion workshop with about 30 stakeholders from science, policy, and practice. We had some fairly influential people there, like the senator of the county was there, and there was really a lot of interest. It certainly helped that we were talking about a decision that was currently on everybody's mind, so that actually really got people to participate here. We followed this with a 2-day modeling workshop with 8 experts selected from among the stakeholders to really build this model. Developed the model code, got feedback from our estimators, ran the model, and then presented results back to the community on 2 occasions. Now here's the model. I don't want to go into detail here. Maybe you probably can't even read it, but basically we have a bunch of boxes and arrows, and they do attempt to make a comprehensive listing of all the benefits people are expecting to derive from this intervention. I mean, there's certainly returns from selling water for some stakeholders, but there are also things like reduced infant mortality here, improved public health, better economic development perspectives for the towns that are involved here, especially the city of Wajir. So there's a whole range of benefits. There are also various costs. We also have environmental impacts here that are monetized in order to make them comparable with everything else. And we also try to be as comprehensive as possible at including different risk factors into this model here. Without too much detail, let me go directly to the results. We modeled results for different stakeholders involved here. So you have the communities, Wajir, Habaswein, some other communities, and also like the downstream, upstream areas, and for example, the water company that is supposed to run the business ultimately. And what you can see in this in these bubbles here is basically the range of outcomes that we're likely to see, and where the bulges are in the bubbles are the most likely outcomes. And you see that for all stakeholders, basically this bulge extends to both sides of 0. So it's actually unclear whether anyone will reap benefits from this as a bottom line, and anybody may win and anybody may lose. I mean, maybe that's not a very interesting result, but it does certainly highlight the fact that this is a very risky undertaking for pretty much everybody involved here. And the wishful thinking, very optimistic scenarios that everything is going to work fine seem unrealistic if you actually include the various risk factors that may affect this intervention. And a nice feature of this type of analysis is that we can identify critical uncertainties. So basically, those variables that most limit our ability to really say what's going to happen. And of course, initially going into the process, most people expected to find those on the hydrological side of things, but it turned out that they actually weren't there. I mean, hydrology is somewhere in the analysis, but actually rather, the risk of salinity intruding into the saline water, intruding into the aquifer. The biggest risk actually, or the biggest uncertainty, turned out to be the value of reducing infant mortality. Because this is, of course, cleaner, safer drinking water may help more babies survive, just plainly speaking. But how do we actually value this as a decision maker? What value do we attach to that? And of course, some governments have fixed values that they apply. In these cases, certainly not the case in Kenya. But this is actually critical for judging the value of this intervention. Also, the economic feasibility of the water business was quite critical, because obviously if this doesn't generate revenue for the water company, this is not going to be sustainable. And also a really critical one at the moment in the present atmosphere, in the present situation, is the risk of political interference, because we already have strong stakeholder groups opposed to the project, which is not a great starting point. And in Kenya, things do get stalled for political reasons quite frequently. So there's a very, very serious risk that's difficult to quantify at the moment. And we also found a few entry points for, basically improving the design of the intervention, things that really have to be taken care of. Certainly, the chance of poor design is quite well, maybe a bit abstract in the model, but that's, if this is designed improperly, if bad materials are used, etc. We've heard that in the morning with hand pumps, then we're basically buying a problem from the beginning that, well, we may save some money in the beginning, but then we pay the price later. Certainly also, one should guard against salinity intrusion, and there are apparently some well designs that are more prone to saline water upconing than others. So this is going to be critical, and ensuring adequate benefit sharing mechanisms is going to be absolutely critical, because otherwise political resistance is probably going to undermine project success quite a bit. Finally, some outcomes and conclusions. It was certainly useful to involve stakeholders in the research process from the beginning, and also to focus on a concrete decision that was currently on everybody's mind. Because, well, unlike experience that we sometimes made, we didn't have to pay anyone to come to our workshops, and still the room was full, because this is actually something people are quite well interested in at the moment. And the structured analysis of the decision's impact pathway certainly enhanced stakeholder understanding of the decision. Few people actually had a grasp of the complexity of the project and all the risks that were involved. And I think that alone that enhanced understanding alone, I think, will lead to better decisions down the road. Several stakeholders actually expressed that they changed their opinions on the interventions, which we would call an outcome. The analysis exposed critical risks that would likely have remained unnoticed if only the predefined feasibility studies had been undertaken. Finally, as a conclusion, also to promote our own work, decision analysis methods have great potential for aiding decisions on groundwater use and also other complex issues under uncertainty and in the face of risks and imperfect information. And those situations are basically ubiquitous in developing countries and even here. So I think we certainly will continue this line of research and try to refine our methods for dealing with these kind of situations. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much indeed. And sort of neatly talks about a lot of issues around water security, about risks and decision-making and uncertainty, so that was excellent. I'd like to now hand over to David MacDonald, most definitely from the British Geological Survey, and to give his presentation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about a catalyst project that's funded within the UPGro programme. It's got a rather long title there, and I defy you to find brave in there, but anyway, it's a good acronym. So the project has been undertaken by a number of organisations: the Africa Climate Exchange, the British Geological Survey, University of Reading, the Water Research Institute in Ghana, the University of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, CARE International, and the Ghana Met Agency. So, but there are a huge number of other institutes in Africa who've contributed to the work, so I just wanted to acknowledge them at the start. So the issue that we're looking at is, well, it's very much been said many times already today, increasing population and with it increasing water demand in Africa, and a recognition that groundwater could play a major role in meeting this increasing demand. And the reason why there's so much emphasis on groundwater is that studies have shown that in the long term the groundwater recharge can be significantly greater than certainly the current level of abstraction. And groundwater has a buffering capacity so that it's able to see, in certain circumstances, see you through periods of drought where surface water resources are more affected. What we were interested to look at, and this came out of issues that came out of previous work that we've done in Africa, specifically in Zimbabwe, is looking at those situations where you get a combination of both climatic and hydrogeological factors that may result in inadequate supplies of groundwater. And what I mean there primarily is lack of continuity of supply. That's both for domestic supply, but also thinking in the future, in a future where groundwater is used more for irrigation. So those two factors would be extended periods of low recharge, periods of drought, combined with areas where there is a relatively low storage and with it low yield potentially from the underlying aquifers. The diagram on the right of the slide shows drought severity index for northern Ghana. Levels below 4 are indicative of severe droughts. 6 would be extreme drought. We can see times when we're seeing significant droughts within the record from the 1900s, but particularly in the 1980s, there was a very significant drought that lasted for quite a significant period of time. And these are the sort of events that we were interested in looking at. If we look at the hydrogeology, this is another one of the maps that was produced by, well, partly by BGS. It's a map of flow and storage type in Africa. And if we just focus on the areas in brown and the areas in red, those are the areas we would probably describe as having low storage. So they cover a significant proportion of sub-Saharan Africa. So the project that we undertook, the BRAVE project, was looking at exploring this question of under what circumstances might the supply of groundwater be under significant stress, and over what and what would be the sort of recurrence of that situation. On top of short-term periods of low recharge, we also have trends in terms of climate and land use. Some of those may actually increase groundwater recharge, as we were hearing earlier on from Mike Todd, and may also, and I'm talking about climate and land use, but they also may result in reduced groundwater recharge. So the project set out with a modelling brief. So the aim was to develop a model that would allow us to explore the impact on groundwater supplies of periods of reduced recharge. We used a land surface model, JULES, which is developed by the UK Met Office. And the reason why we were interested in that, it was mentioned specifically in the call for the Catalyst grants. It's a model that has a lot of interest behind it within the UK, partly because it's a community model which is open sourced, and so, but it has quite a high data requirement. So we wanted to look at whether that was appropriate for the sort of environments we're looking at. And Zoom is the in-house BGS groundwater flow model. So we're going to apply that model to case studies within the River Volta Basin, and I'll mention a little bit about those areas that we addressed within that region, and use the model as a means to examine the sensitivity of groundwater recharge to key climate and land use controls. And as part of this project, and one of the aims of the Catalyst phase of UPGro was to develop the networks that we could then take on and look at the specific issues associated with this particular issue. And thankfully, the BRAVE project has been funded for a second phase. It's got one of the consortium grants, so we're in a good position now, having developed those networks, to move forward. So this is a couple of maps which show you the River Volta Basin. The River Volta Basin is shown by the green outline, and the majority of it sits within Burkina Faso, which is the country to the north. It's a little bit difficult without a pointer, but and Ghana, which is the country which has the large dam in the centre of it. But you can see that most of this region is underlain by either fractured or weathered and fractured rocks, so what are likely to be relatively low storage aquifers. So we looked at a specific catchment, that where a lot of work had been done previously, so there were data available. And then subsequently we looked at a number of locations in a transect going from south to north within the basin. So we're going from more arid to less arid, applying the insights that we got from the Atonquiddy catchment. As I say, the Atonquiddy catchment had a lot of work done on it before, and really we were restricted to pretty much information that was already available. And this work was done in the catchment as part of the Glow Volta project. And then subsequently, IMI has funded quite a bit of work in the area. And we've got maps of the soils, of the land cover, which is primarily agricultural, and the geology, which is on the right, which is again, it's totally weathered basement. In addition to the surveyed information, there was also some time series data, both for groundwater levels and for flows that we could use to help assess whether our model was giving us sensible results. So just to get into a little bit of detail, because it kind of makes it more interesting, I suppose. I've got a plot here of the rainfall from a nearby rain station to the catchment, the Navrongo synoptic weather station. So it had both rainfall and other climatic variables that were being measured there over a long period of time. We haven't got the full record in front of us here. We can see an average rainfall of nearly 1,000 millimeters. And then using the model that we developed, we produced, we calculated the recharge for that period of 40 years. And what you can see is that although the long-term average is around about 8%, there is a huge amount of variability within that record. So we've got a standard deviation which is about equal to the average annual rainfall.
David.
So we've looked at aspects of variability of groundwater recharge, and the plots just show you, illustrate again the huge variability in total recharge over the period of a season. 2004, a maximum of 37 compared with 435 in 2007. But what we were interested in was trying to think, as well as doing the detailed modelling that would allow us to better understand the processes, we were thinking about how we simplify this to make it perhaps more relevant to people who are making decisions about how you go about developing groundwater. So taking a very simple water balance approach, and this is where the hydrogeologists need to look away for a moment, but if we imagine our aquifer, which is a weathered basement aquifer, likely to be bounded by some hard bedrock, we see it as a bucket filled with sand. We've got water going in, which is our recharge. We've got the regional flow, so that's water that's going through the cracks in the bedrock. And we can imagine that as sort of holes in the bottom of our bucket. And then we've got some base flow going out, which is maybe a hole in the side of our bucket. And we take a simple water balance approach. What water goes in, what water goes out. We can make an assessment of how much goes out because we assume that over the average recharge that we've got is over the period of 40 years is likely to be the average amount of water that sort of disappears from the aquifer. So what we get is a plot here which shows how much water is in the aquifer at the end of the dry season. If you can think of each of those bars as being a bucket, so we're seeing the level in the bucket rising, and then as a result of periods of low recharge, the storage in the aquifer declining. And if we take a kind of nominal base of the well, then we can see that we've got what we call as well failure 4 out of the 42 years. And that's assuming no abstraction. If abstraction is increased to being about 5% of the recharge, then we see that we're getting failure 9 out of 42 years. Or we can look at that another way, that we've got the median number of consecutive years of well failure is 4, and that's significant in terms of addressing emergencies. The length of time that the source of water is under significant stress is important for those that are planning groundwater supplies. Now, this is all based on one conceptual model, and there may be others, and that's kind of where we're going with the rest of the project. We're looking at developing planning tools which identify regions where planners need to take into account there may not be sufficient storage within the aquifer to be able to deal with extended periods of low recharge. That national mapping, we want to bring in real-time information to help those that are able to respond to developing periods of stress, and then also use these models in a simplified approach to help develop local advice on sustainable groundwater development, all within the important governance context, which is another key aspect of the project. So very finally, what we're wanting to do is link in with the Rainwatch initiative, and this is an initiative which gets data directly from the Met agencies in a number of Sahel countries, and provides that information in near to real time, so that you can see what is developing within this within the country. And the red numbers tell you where the rainfall is in relation to the long-term record. So we can see in the south of Burkina Faso in Po, the north of Navrongo just across the border, we're at 20th percentile and a less than 10th percentile, and this is data that's very current. And the black line shows you where we are this year in relation to the blue line, which is the average. So we're trying to build in groundwater to this to be able to alert people to situations as they develop.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So those were 3 excellent presentations looking at water security from different perspectives. A lot to deal with risks and decision making and choices and those sort of interactions which are difficult from a governance perspective in terms of what benefits may accrue. We'll now open it up to questions to the audience, and if they can be questions rather than long anecdotes, we'd be very, very appreciative. There will be a coffee break where you can anecdote to your heart's content. So if there are any questions over there on the left.
Yeah, so when I was in
just microphone everybody.
So it's a joke. Jokes at meetings never go down well, do they? The thing is, no one's expecting them. Everyone's expecting to be, to be serious. So my question, which I've forgotten now, was to David MacDonald on the Brave project. You started off with a slide on looking at the Sahel drought, and then you showed your data specifically for northern Ghana. And I was interested to ask whether or not any of your modelling work illustrates or encapsulates anything which might support that Sahel paradox hypothesis that quite a few French researchers have identified, whereby decreased rainfall was not accompanied by a reduction in groundwater in the Sahel, because the land surface responded to climate, and that resulted in, that's the hypothesis anyway, that resulted in enhanced recharge as the land surface changed. So I just wonder if you had any, if there's any support or any comment on that from your data.
Good, thank you. Let's just take a couple more.
Okay.
That one's for you, definitely. Jeff, you had a question over here, and then this lady.
Thank you. I was just want to question the second speaker. I'm not sure. Ike. Right.
Ike.
Thank you. Two related questions, very briefly. One, you had monetized all of your quantities. Did you consider any other approaches? Because obviously some things can't be monetized, and there are other approaches that you can take. And the second question, if I can, did you look at alternative scenarios? Because following these approaches, often you are looking at 2 alternative scenarios which could be either develop or not develop business as usual, and all of the issues that were raised would also apply to the don't develop scenario. So sometimes you need to see alternatives to be able to make a comparison.
Okay, can I ask, has anybody got a question for Rachel? So then we have a question for each of our speakers. This lady here had a hand up. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, the question is to Rachel. If groundwater in the coastal areas of Kenya is likely to be saline, what could be the consequences to the agriculture and horticultural activities, and how can the communities manage this?
Okay, great. If David can remember his question, do you want to start off?
Yes. So the question was around the Sahel paradox, that the we've got increasing levels of recharge being reported. Certainly, the results of the modelling that we've done show the importance of the vegetation in controlling the groundwater recharge. Perhaps not so significant as the soils, but certainly the location that we were doing most of the modelling in, we were seeing greater recharge in those areas that had been moved to agricultural use compared with those that had been under natural vegetation, which is really, I think, is kind of, you know, what answers that question of why recharge is increasing because of the significant change in land cover. We didn't, within that recharge time series, actually incorporate the change in land cover, which would have perhaps given us quite significant differences in the recharge values we got. We just felt that was kind of one thing more than we could do within the time that we've got. But yeah, that's it is going to be a very important issue that we need to pick up in the next phase of the project.
Thank you. Micah, do you want to?
No and yes. No, well, two questions, two answers. No. Well, actually, we did monetize everything. We didn't, in this case, we didn't consider other approaches because, I mean, partly, as I said, we're using business analysis methods, so the people we were kind of learning them from are very think in monetary terms. There are also some other benefits, though, because often the non-monetized things, they kind of fall on the table when actual decisions are made. I mean, the fuzzy factors, they're somewhere in the footnotes, but I mean, often people will look at the economic bottom line of things. And so we did try. I mean, also another thing, even the things that are not monetized, they often matter to us because they have real effects. Yeah, they have real effects that will ultimately benefit someone or not. I mean, they can be translated into monetary terms. So that's why we stuck with this. Also, we wanted to have everything in a single unit to have kind of an overall bottom line to things. We realize there are other approaches, but this is currently where we're going. In terms of alternative scenarios, we actually had two scenarios here. We had one where we considered all risks that we could think of, and one way where we excluded the political risks, just to see how overall desirable it would be to have this project. And we did try to model everything based to a counterfactual where we don't actually develop anything at all. I mean, in hindsight, I mean, we had our stakeholders guide what's in the model, and we probably should have emphasized the fact that there could be very, very negative consequences of doing nothing. I mean, higher population density and bad groundwater, cholera epidemics. I don't know what could have happened. I don't think we paid enough attention to that. That would have been better.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Your question was on the impact of saline intrusion on agriculture and forestry in those areas. Well, I think it is possible to sustainably manage groundwater in coastal areas, but you have to stay within the sustainable yield of the aquifer. You need to understand how much recharge there is, and also how much. I think you need to understand understand the aquifer. You need to calculate abstraction rates existing. You need to know how much water is stored there, how much fresh water. You need to understand and be able to forecast recharge, and also use the correct technologies in terms of well depth, well diameter. I mean, it's possible to have many wells with small abstraction rates spread across an area that can remain fresh compared to one very deep well with a huge abstraction rate that sucks the water in. So it's a matter of management. In that area of Kenya, Kilifi has a very high urban population. The water demand there cannot be met by groundwater, so water is being taken in from the Athi Sabaki catchment to the north at the moment and in future. Issues that are arising within that catchment are that Del Monte have set up a huge pineapple farm inland, which will have a water demand, which will take water away from the coastal areas, and there's a lot of recharge associated as well with river basins in those areas leaking back into groundwater. So it's a very complex question, but I think the key to it is to understand the physical characteristics of the resource and the driving factors, both environmental and social.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We've got our online audience has got a couple of questions, so if I can intervene here. It's a quiet afternoon in Gland. Sean Fury is back online, and he's asking us, to all speakers, how can climate change be incorporated into risk analysis? Or is this signal dwarfed by other factors such as land use change? So that's one question which maybe I'll think about Rachel answering that one, because I've got one for David from Raj at the Climate Change Programme at IDRC in Ottawa in Canada. David, could you please explain on some of the challenges around working across such a diverse group of stakeholders, and more specifically on developing a common understanding of groundwater issues in the watershed? So let's just respond to those, and if we have any other online. Yeah.
You can take it one if you want.
Do you want to take that one?
Climate change?
Yeah, you can have it
Okay.
back if you want. I
Sorry, I mean, I don't want to say.
Fair enough, okay.
No, it so happens that I've worked on climate change most of my career and have recently moved away from it. I mean,
Apologies.
you had no way of knowing, I guess. No, the thing is, I think these days we often focus a lot of climate change, and I often feel like we have more studies including climate risks into these kind of assessments than studies that actually deal with all the other risks. And I think the challenge these days is to actually put climate change in its place compared to all the other risks we're facing. Because as much as climate change may be one of our biggest challenges at the global scale, the question is to what extent is it ever the most important challenge in any local situation. So to really, I think what we have to find is a way to assess all risks that we're dealing with with their relative importance, assess the magnitude, and I think that is a major challenge. It's not particularly difficult to include climate risks in these kind of studies. We have all our IPCC scenarios, we can run all those things, but I think the other risks are the ones that are actually the more challenging ones, especially if you consider the social dynamics that are going on in Africa, the demographic changes, everything, and modernization. Anything really. There's so many risks and uncertainties that are greater than climate change, probably.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good answer. David?
So yeah, the first question related to challenges with working with a range of stakeholders. We had a number of stakeholder workshops as part of the project, and it was interesting to see the different perspectives, government, identifying that a large amount of data existed, and that this data wasn't being used yet. The NGOs that were present saying that they would dearly love to get hold of the data, but the government wasn't making it available. So there's clearly issues with sort of communication there, or perhaps some groups kind of holding on to data because that data has a value to it. The second question was about the communities, I think, and their understanding of groundwater. One sort of thing that comes to mind is there is a sort of belief, and I'm talking about Ghana here in particular, that groundwater isn't used for small-scale irrigation, and the figures for groundwater abstraction or groundwater irrigation are very, very small, the official figures. But actually work that was done in this catchment that we were working in showed that almost half of the households were using groundwater at some stage to irrigate perhaps just a small plot of vegetables. And it may be that this particular area groundwater had taken off for some reason, but I think it's just interesting that I think there's a kind of understanding that's there perhaps, then it's maybe in some cases us not realizing that the understanding is there and not communicating well enough. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we had 2 earlier questions, if this gentleman's still... Excellent.
Mohammed Haq from Imperial College London. I have a question for Rachel. Now, thank you for the nice presentation. Just one question is that did anybody there working in this drinking water salinity in the coastal areas where you are working have found any kind of impact on the human health? Because we are working on the salinity problem in Bangladesh at the moment, and School of Public Health Imperial College, they have found a dose-response relationship with the drinking water salinity and hypertension, particularly with pregnant women, and then new studies coming up. It's a general phenomenon actually. It's with the general public as well. So
okay.
Do you aware of any kind of health impact similar in the area where you are working?
Okay, well can you just remember that? There's a question over here. Alva, you're done? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, this gentleman, excellent.
Yeah, it's a question for you. I'm afraid I've got your name.
Okay, yeah.
I'm just wondering, with the how much money has actually been sunk into this project so far? Because I mean, how much risk has been taken out of the understanding about the resource? And it's a borehole being drilled already. There's been done pumping tests, etc. Before they go on to plan about the pipelines and all the other stuff.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
I've got a question for Rachel, and it was were scavenger wells considered when looking at pumping from the boreholes, or was it just using one pump?
On the are we waiting?
Are there any other questions, or should we take those? You don't have to ask a question now, but it's fine. Okay, let's take those. There was a question for Ike and a question for Rachel. Do you want to start, Rachel?
Yeah, well, firstly on the hypertension was something we had thought about prior to going into the areas, but in all the discussions with healthcare workers in the 3 countries, nobody has ever raised it as an issue, and it's not considered at all in any of our questionnaires. In the areas, it never came up. Anything to do with human health was always related to fecal coliforms and maybe excess levels of nitrate. But it's never, even though the water is too salty that we would consider to drink, and they still drink it, but it's never, maybe they're particularly healthy. I don't know.
Okay. Do you want to take that question?
Yeah, how much money's been sunk? I don't know if all of the money's been spent, but the Dutch donor approved an initial grant for feasibility studies of, I think, 0.8 million euros or something like that. I don't know what's been spent on the government side already. And as far as I know, they have not actually drilled test boreholes, partly because there are a bunch of boreholes already that are they're already producing, so they've tried to use information from those wells primarily. But it's also been difficult actually to work in the region, because sometimes they were chased away by the locals. That's also an interesting fact related to the benefit sharing and political resistance issue. But I mean, certainly, the big not too much money has been spent already, but a little bit already.
Okay, and then I think question over here.
On the scavenger pumps, not in any of our 3 small-ish area. Oh, yeah, not in our 3 small areas. It's really basic. It's hand pumps or it's a bucket. And where there is infrastructure, it's just a single pump in the well. So no, not at all in any of the 3 countries in those study areas.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Any more questions you have? Go on, Alva.
Well, I don't know the area very well, but it's a question for David on. I was gonna make the link with water security and food security, and think about possibilities of conjunctive use, surface groundwater in the area you studied. And I was thinking, looking at those peaks with drought episodes, whether people were relying on for food production, for instance, but whether people were relying on rainwater for small irrigation, for farming, and whether they switched to groundwater during those episodes, and if that was a trend that was carried on or not.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of surface water resources that last anywhere beyond the wet season, where we were doing our work, there was nothing really. There's been some discussion of developing small dams, not for recharging water, but for holding water up and then using as a source of irrigation water. There is some. I mean, there isn't a huge amount of groundwater irrigation going on generally, but there is in one part of this catchment. There's been quite a lot of activity mostly within the poorer sectors of society, people that don't have land, that go in and with the permission of the landowners, set up small irrigation plots in the alluvial deposits that sit at the base of along the river valley. They're dug seasonally and then they're filled in at the end of the season because of the risk of animals falling in, and that has proven apparently it's been very successful in reversing the migration of people away from the catchment at certain times of the year, because there is employment, the nutritional value of the crops that have been grown are also had a very significant impact on some sectors. So that doesn't really answer your question about there isn't anything really in so the trend in terms of the use of that groundwater has increased, but it's now stabilizing because with that it's a relatively small aquifer, and they've got to the point where it's sort of capacity. I should say though the big issue now is pest control, and that there isn't the money to be able to buy the materials to get rid of the tomato crop pests. So that's the thing that's kind of scuppered a lot of this. So that's an important message.
Gentleman at the back, and then
this question's to Rachel. You mentioned about the short-termism of NGOs, etc., and they were looking at a 2-year project cycle or whatever it might be, and get the job done in that particular amount of time. What's your solution to short-termism? Have you got any ideas how to?
Okay, great, thank you. This lady here.
Okay, my question is to David. Are there any issues of upstream and downstream groundwater withdrawals in Ghana or in Burkina Faso since the damming of the River Volta in Burkina Faso?
Okay, there was another question, this gentleman here at the front.
Thank you very much. It's going to be to yourself, Ike, if that's okay. This is the first time, I've got to say, I've seen an attempt to monetize that type of approach to the work we do, to the extent, because it's the big difference between the work I would do in the UK, where we will monetize the value of the loss of 2 liters per second in the Stour. And you go to Africa, if you can provide water, benefit, tick in the box. I've never actually seen it and a value to a human life, which is what you've done. Is this something we're going to see more of? Is this something we're going to have to try and adapt? Because I don't quite know how we're going to adapt what I've seen you try to do this. You do. You have done it. Sorry, I didn't say try to do. You have done it. I'm interested in your comment, how we take that forward.
Okay, well, let's take those questions. Ike, do you want to start with that?
Kenya, well, I hope we're going to see more of it. I mean, because in the group I work in, we believe that this can make a huge contribution. I mean, if there's actually a lot of excitement in Kenya right now. They've discovered, UNESCO has discovered new aquifers, and there's a big hype about it. Nobody knows how feasible it will be to get that out and to use it in various ways. And I think that dimension is missing so far from much of the planning around water resources, but also about other things. People get excited about opportunities and they don't actually think things through from the financial point of view. So we think that we can benefit a lot from adopting these approaches, and we will try to make it more common, but we're not many so far, but hopefully increasing in numbers.
Okay, thank you. David, do you want to take the upstream downstream question?
Yes, as far as groundwater is concerned, I wouldn't expect there to be any major issues between Burkina Faso and Ghana that's downstream. The aquifers that we're looking at are weathered aquifers, and the degree to which those are continuous over large areas is they're unlikely to be continuous over large areas. So in terms of kind of spanning transboundaries, that's not really an issue. But I'm sure there are lots of surface water issues associated.
Okay, and then the enduring question of short-termism and development. You've got 2 minutes to answer that, Rachel. The solution.
Long-termism, I think. I don't know. It came up in Comoros on a French project where they had 3 years, and the wells they were given X amount of money to do this and provide an amount of abstraction, and they couldn't go with the traditional approach, which was too slow, so they went. And I suppose it comes to what the metrics are for a funding agency's success. Whether having initiated and that something's in progress is considered successful rather than it having to be finished and signed off and everything done. I think it has to change from the development agencies, but I don't know how that goes, given the way money from Europe and other on a European scale, money's handed out in 5 and 6 year lumps. I don't know, but I do know that it's ridiculous to waste money.
It's not particularly new. I mean, there's a famous book in Tanzania, which you may know of, Ola Thirkielson's book, Watering White Elephants in Africa, which is one of my favourite titles, published in 1988, discusses exactly the issue you're talking about, and where we are 20, 25 years beyond from that, we seem to still have exactly the same problems. It's a little bit disappointing.
You always have to have something to prove that you've done something, and that those metrics are probably the root of the problem most of the time, I think.
Okay, we probably have time for 1 or 2 final questions, if there are any other. Jeff, do you have another one?
Am I allowed a brief comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to sort of round off the question I gave and your comment about the monetarisation, there are lots of ways of producing common comparators using indicators that don't need to be assigned a monetary value, that have been used in integrated water resource management, where you use indicators to try and produce some comparative level. And I think that there's a little bit of a risk when you apply monetary values that people then interpret that differently. And sometimes there's a benefit in not monetarising things, but still following the same approach.
Can I answer that?
Well, yes, you may.
I mean, that's true, I think, but I mean, ultimately, a political decision maker will still have to decide how much money to allocate to a particular topic. So ultimately, he will need to decide how much it's worth to them. And in an environment of scarce resources, like where we don't have money for everything, somehow those considerations are inevitable to some. I mean, I do resist philosophically a bit the idea to monetize everything, but there is a necessity, I think, sometimes to do it when money actually needs to be spent at some point. Just
okay, John, very
comment
quick
back.
question rather than a long commentary, please.
Short comment. I think what's interesting to me is that she's looking at failed boreholes in a completely different physical and social environment. She's come up with the same sort of symptoms of failure and different causal factors, and going back to different underlying causes like the short-termism. So it's the same sort of logic applied to a different environment. So I'm good.
Okay, well, I think that's a nice point in which to conclude. I think the whole nature of water security is to try and think through these risks and decisions, the decision-making process, and how we arrive at them. I think the valuation point is well taken. It's very difficult, and it becomes a political thing, that sometimes you move from measuring what you value to valuing what you measure, and this is imperceptible but happens in political processes, that we chase the targets rather than actually questioning what the targets are to some degree. I'd like to thank the three speakers for their excellent presentation, both extremely informative. They ran over time, but they were very interesting, so they merited the extra time. And thank you all very much for your questions too.